Last time, we told you what the snow was hiding. For bodies in a ravine under 4 meters of snow, found in May 1959 when the winter finally began to release its grip on the northern Urals. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol with a major skull fracture and no external wound. Semyon Zolotaryov with massive chest trauma and empty eye sockets. Lyudmila Dubinina with 11 broken ribs and no external damage and no tongue and no eyes. Alexander Kolevatov with a broken nose and a deformed neck and no eyebrows. And on some of their clothing, radiation from an unknown source in a place where no radiation should have been. And the Soviet government sealed everything, classified the files, issued one conclusion, a compelling natural force, and said nothing more. This is episode 3. This is where we ask the question that 65 years of researchers and investigators and scientists and theorists have been asking. What was the compelling natural force? What happened on Dead Mountain on the night of February 1st, 1959? What drove 9 experienced hikers from their tent into -40 degrees without their boots? What left those injuries on those 4 bodies in that ravine? I am going to tell you every serious theory that has been proposed. I am going to tell you what the evidence says about each one. And I am going to tell you honestly which ones fail, which ones come closer, and why after 65 years there is still no answer that satisfies everyone who has studied this case. Because the truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident is not that it is unsolvable. The truth is that every explanation explains some of the evidence, and none of them explains all of it. And that gap, that space between what can be explained and what cannot, is where 9 people died, and where they remain, still waiting for an answer. The first theory is the simplest, and in some ways the most unsatisfying: an avalanche. The slope where the Dyatlov group camped was at approximately 30 degrees, a slope angle that under certain snow conditions can produce an avalanche. The group had cut into the slope to level their tent platform. This kind of disturbance can, in some circumstances, destabilize a snow layer above. The theory goes like this. Sometime in the night of February 1st, a slab of snow broke loose from the slope above the tent. It struck the tent. The hikers inside felt the weight of the snow pressing down on them. They panicked. They cut their way out of the tent from the inside to escape the weight of the snow above them. They ran downhill toward the treeline because running toward the treeline meant running away from the slope and away from the threat. The chest injuries on the bodies in the ravine, the skull fractures. These could be explained by the snow slab striking the hikers as they lay in their sleeping bags. Snow under the right conditions can transmit force the way water does, distributing impact without concentrating it at the surface, which would explain injuries of crushing force with no external marks on the skin. This theory has been advanced by serious scientists. In 2021, a study published in the journal Communications Earth and Environment used computer modeling to show how a slab avalanche could have occurred on that slope under specific snow conditions. The study was peer-reviewed. It was taken seriously by the scientific community, but there are problems. The first problem is that when the search party arrived on February 26th, 25 days after the hikers died, the tent was still standing. It had been damaged from the inside by the cuts, but the structure was intact. If a slab avalanche had struck the tent with enough force to cause the injuries found on Dubinina and Zolotaryov, it is very difficult to understand how the tent could still be standing 25 days later. The second problem is the footprints. The search party found 8 or 9 sets of footprints leading from the tent down the slope toward the treeline. In an avalanche scenario, those footprints would have been buried or destroyed by the snow, but they were clearly visible 25 days later. The third problem is the slope itself. The area where the group camped was not known as an avalanche zone. In 65 years of winter activity in that area since 1959, no avalanche has ever been recorded on that slope. The fourth problem is the distance. The injuries were found on the bodies in the ravine, half a mile from the tent. If the avalanche struck the tent, why are the worst injuries on the people who got furthest from the tent? Why are the people who died closest to the tent the ones with the least severe injuries? The avalanche theory explains some things. It does not explain all of them, and the things it does not explain are the things that matter most. The second theory is one that most people have not heard of, but which some researchers consider the most compelling explanation for why 9 people left their tent in such sudden and absolute terror. Infrasound. Infrasound is sound below the frequency range of human hearing, below 20 Hz, sound that the human ear cannot detect consciously, but which the human body can feel. Research into infrasound has documented its effects on human beings. In controlled studies, infrasound exposure has produced feelings of unease, of dread, of panic, of the sensation that something is deeply wrong without any visible cause, of the feeling that someone or something is present in the room that cannot be seen. Some researchers have linked infrasound to reported ghost sightings, to the feeling that a location is haunted, to the inexplicable dread that some people report in certain buildings or landscapes. The infrasound theory for the Dyatlov Pass was popularized by American writer Donnie Icar in his 2013 book Dead Mountain. After consulting with physicists, Icar concluded that the specific geography of the mountain pass where the group camped could have produced infrasound under certain wind conditions. The curvature of the mountains surrounding the campsite, the way the wind moved through that particular valley, could, under the right conditions, have created a standing wave of infrasound directed at exactly the point where the tent was pitched. The hikers would have heard nothing. They would have felt something, a rising sense of panic with no visible cause, a growing certainty that something was terribly wrong, an overwhelming animal urge to get out, to run, to put distance between themselves and whatever their bodies were telling them was threatening them. 9 people all experiencing the same infrasound at the same time would have all felt the same panic simultaneously, which would explain why all 9 left the tent together, why there was no attempt to investigate the cause, why they just ran. This theory has real scientific support. Infrasound is real. Its effects on human psychology are documented, but it has problems too. If infrasound panic drove them from the tent, why did some of them have the presence of mind to build a fire at the cedar tree? Building a fire requires focused thought, requires collecting materials, requires the ability to perform complex tasks in sequence. These are not the actions of people in the grip of absolute blind panic. And infrasound does not explain the injuries, the fractured skulls, the crushed chests, the missing eyes, the missing tongue. Infrasound explains why they ran. It does not explain what happened to them after they ran. And what happened to them after they ran is the part that has never been explained. The third theory is the one that most ordinary people know about, the one that has made the Dyatlov Pass incident famous beyond the circles of mystery researchers and mountaineering historians. Soviet military involvement, the radiation on the clothing, the strange injuries, the swift closure of the investigation, the classified files, the conclusion that explained nothing. These things taken together suggest to many researchers that the Soviet government knew more than it said, that the official conclusion was not a failure to understand what had happened, but a deliberate concealment of what had happened. The specific version of this theory that has the most traction involves weapons testing. The Soviet military in 1959 was conducting extensive testing of various weapon systems in the Ural region. Parachute mines, rockets, various classified projects whose full nature has never been disclosed. The theory suggests that the Dyatlov group unknowingly camped in or near an area where military testing was taking place, that some kind of weapons test occurred on the night of February 1st, that the hikers were killed or fatally injured by the effects of this test, and that the Soviet government classified everything because acknowledging what happened would have meant acknowledging that they had killed 9 of their own citizens through a classified weapons test. The radiation on the clothing is the strongest piece of evidence for this theory. One of the hikers, Krivonischenko, had worked at a nuclear facility. This could explain some radiation on his clothing through ordinary contamination from his workplace. But the radiation was found on multiple items belonging to multiple hikers, in quantities that some researchers consider too significant to be explained by workplace contamination alone. The injuries on the final 4 bodies are also used to support this theory. The pattern of damage, internal injuries without external marks, eyes removed without visible trauma to the surrounding tissue. These things have been compared to the effects of certain pressure weapons or certain types of explosive blast. The head of the Dyatlov Foundation himself, Yuri Kuntsevich, who attended 5 of the hikers' funerals as a 12-year-old boy, said in 2016 that he believed the hikers may have been on a secret mission for the KGB to photograph some kind of classified military technology, and that something went wrong. This theory cannot be proven. The relevant Soviet military records, if they exist, remain classified. The Russian government has not acknowledged any military activity in the area on the night of February 1st, 1959, but it cannot be disproven either. And the questions it raises about what the government knew, about why the files were sealed, about what a compelling natural force actually means when the government that coined the phrase refuses to specify what the force was. Those questions have never been answered, and they may never be. There is a 4th theory that I want to tell you about, not because I think it is the most likely explanation, but because it tells us something important about how human beings respond to mysteries they cannot explain. The Yeti. In 2014, the Discovery Channel produced a documentary called Russian Yeti: The Killer Lives. In it, a team of researchers investigated the possibility that the Dyatlov group had been attacked by a Bigfoot-type creature in the Ural Mountains. The documentary presented various pieces of evidence and concluded that a Yeti attack was a serious possibility. The documentary was not well received by serious researchers. The evidence presented was fabricated or misrepresented. The conclusions were not supported by the physical record. The whole enterprise was, as one researcher put it, an entertainment product dressed up as investigation. And yet, the Yeti theory persists. It has a following. People believe it. Why? Because the injuries on the final 4 bodies are genuinely difficult to explain by ordinary means. Because the missing tongue and the missing eyes and the internal damage without external marks. These things feel like they require an extraordinary explanation, and a creature powerful enough to cause that kind of damage without leaving conventional marks fills a psychological gap that more prosaic theories leave open. The problem is the evidence, or rather the lack of it. There were no large animal tracks found at the scene. The Mansi people who knew these mountains intimately and who were interviewed extensively during the investigation reported no knowledge of any creature that could cause the injuries described. The physical evidence at the scene is not consistent with an animal attack. The Yeti theory fails on the evidence, but it tells us something true about the Dyatlov Pass incident. It tells us that the injuries on those 4 bodies in the ravine are disturbing enough, unexplained enough, that people will reach for extraordinary explanations because the ordinary ones feel insufficient. That is not nothing. That is actually important. I want to tell you about the most recent serious attempt to explain the Dyatlov Pass incident. In 2021, 2 Swiss scientists published a study in the peer-reviewed journal Communications Earth and Environment. Johann Gaum and Alexander Puzrin. They used computer modeling to reconstruct what might have happened on the slope of Dead Mountain on the night of February 1st, 1959. Their conclusion was a slab avalanche, but not a conventional avalanche, a very specific and unusual type. A small delayed slab avalanche caused by progressive wind-blown snow accumulation on the slope above the tent. The model showed that under specific conditions, wind blowing from a certain direction, snow accumulating at a certain rate. A small slab of snow could have formed above the tent in the hours after the group went to sleep and slid down onto the tent with enough force to cause the injuries found on the bodies in the ravine. The study was taken seriously because it addressed some of the objections to conventional avalanche theories. The computer model showed how the injuries could have occurred without destroying the tent, how the snow slab could have caused internal injuries without external marks. But it did not address everything. The missing eyes, the missing tongue, the radiation on the clothing, the glowing orbs reported by witnesses in the sky over the northern Urals that night. None of these things appear in the Swiss study. The authors acknowledged this. They acknowledged that their model explained the injuries and the tent cutting and the flight from the camp. But they made no claim to explain all of the evidence, because no single theory explains all of the evidence. Every theory explains some things and fails to explain others. The avalanche explains the injuries, but not the tent. The infrasound explains the flight, but not the injuries. The military theory explains the radiation, but requires assumptions that cannot be proven. And what happened to the tongue, the eyes, the eyebrows? These things remain unexplained by every theory. Every single one. I have spent 60 years thinking about this case, reading every document, speaking to every witness, walking that mountain myself, and I can tell you this: the most honest answer to the question of what happened on Dead Mountain is the answer that the most careful researchers all arrive at eventually. We do not know. We have theories. We have evidence. We have 65 years of investigation and analysis and scientific study, and we do not know. This is episode 3 of the Dyatlov Pass. What the truth might be, what the evidence ultimately points toward, and how the story of 9 people on a mountain in 1959 finally ended for the people who loved them. That is the story of episode 4, the final episode. Subscribe to Gray Archive Tales and come back. We will be waiting.